The distress beacon screamed through empty space, crying out in 17 different languages that species across the galaxy could understand. And the message it carried was simple enough that even a child could grasp its meaning. A colony world was dying. Defenders were down to their final hours, and coordinates were attached for anyone brave or foolish enough to respond. Made this particular beacon different from the thousands of other desperate pleas that echoed through the Orion Arm. During these bloody years was a single critical detail that would change everything. It had been transmitted on an ancient human emergency frequency, one that hadn't been activated or heard in over 200 years. A relic from wars so devastating that entire species still refused to speak of. The signal traveled through the void at light speed, until it finally reached the Terran hegemony's deep space. Monitoring station positioned at the very edge of what civilized species considered safe territory. And there it triggered automated systems that had been waiting in silence for centuries. Admiral Marcus Chen stood motionless before the massive holographic display that dominated the command center, his weathered face bathed in the pulsing red light of the emergency marker, and the lines around his eyes spoke of decades spent making impossible decisions that kept humanity alive in a universe that had tried countless times to exterminate them. The world sending the distress call was designated as refuge on the old colonial maps, a remote settlement established by human pioneers 3 generations ago, when humanity was still expanding outward with the naive hope that the galaxy might welcome them. And now that world barely registered on current navigation charts because so many assumed it had been abandoned or destroyed. Long ago, Chen's hands trembled slightly as he read the transmission data, not from fear, but from the weight of what this meant. Because that ancient frequency wasn't just some forgotten radio channel from humanity's past. Every ship in the Ghost Fleet had been hardwired to respond to that frequency, programmed at the molecular level of their navigation computers to treat any signal on that band as an absolute priority that overrode every other command in consideration. And the Ghost Fleet wasn't just another naval formation. These were the vessels that had ended the succession wars when human factions nearly tore themselves apart. The ships that had broken the siege of New Terra when 6 alien species united to destroy humanity's second homeworld. The armada that had carried out the infamous Scorched Stars campaign that left 3 entire enemy civilizations too terrified to ever threaten human space again, sir, communications officer said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper because everyone in the command center understood the gravity of what was happening. Ghost Fleet acknowledgement signals are coming in. Chen nodded slowly and watched as confirmation icons appeared on the display, each one representing a vessel that was already changing course, already accelerating toward the coordinates that Refuge had transmitted. The protocol was older than most of the crew members in the station. Written in the bloodiest days of human history, when colonies vanished overnight and no one came to save them, when humanity learned the hard lesson that the galaxy respected only strength and that mercy was a luxury reserved for species powerful enough to enforce it. How many ships are responding? Chen asked, though he already knew the answer because the Ghost Fleet never deployed in half measures all of them. Sir, the officer replied, and there was something like awe in her voice, mixed with an ancient fear that humans had carried since they first looked up at the stars. 37 capital ships, full battle carrier groups. The entire fleet. Chen pulled up the tactical display and studied the projected routes, watching as the computer calculated intercept times and optimal attack vectors, and he felt the familiar cold sensation in his chest that always came before humanity reminded the galaxy why it had survived when so many others had fallen. The Ghost Fleet ships were already moving faster than should have been possible, pushing their faster-than-light drives beyond normal safety limits because the frequency that had been triggered meant one thing and one thing only. Humans were dying, and someone would pay for it in blood and fire. Notified Terran Command, Chen ordered, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who had done this before and knew exactly what horrors were about to be unleashed. Tell them Ghost Fleet protocols have been activated, and we are moving to respond to colonial distress call at Refuge. He paused and looked at the young faces around him. Officers who had grown up in the relative peace that the Ghost Fleet had purchased with rivers of enemy blood, and he wondered if they truly understood what they were about to witness. Also send a message to the refuge beacon, he continued. Tell them help is coming and that they need to hold on just a little longer. The message would take hours to reach refuge, and Chun knew that hours might be too long. That the colony could fall before the first Ghost Fleet vessel arrived. But he sent it anyway because humans didn't abandon their own, and even if everyone on refuge died before help arrived, the response would be exactly the same on the display. He watched the Ghost Fleet signatures accelerate to speeds that would have torn apart lesser vessels. Watched as they formed up into attack formations that had been practiced and perfected over centuries of warfare. And he thought about the species that had made the fatal mistake of attacking a human colony. They would learn, he thought grimly, or they would cease to exist. Because those were the only two options that humanity offered to its enemies anymore. The lead vessel's signature pulsed brighter on the display, and Chen recognized it immediately, the THS Absolute Zero, the flagship of the Ghost Fleet. A dreadnought so massive that smaller species had mistaken it for a moon when they first encountered it. That ship alone carried enough firepower to sterilize a planet or shatter a fleet. And it was just one of 37. Chen had served on the Absolute Zero during the final battles of the Carthon conflict when humanity had demonstrated to a particularly aggressive species exactly what happened to civilizations that attempted genocide against human worlds. And the memories of that campaign still haunted his dreams, sir, another officer called out, younger than the others, and clearly struggling to keep the tremor out of his voice. Should we notify the Galactic Council about the Ghost Fleet deployment? Chen almost smiled at that, a cold expression that held no humor whatsoever. The Council will know soon enough, he said quietly. They'll know when they start receiving casualty reports from whoever was foolish enough to attack. Refuge, he turned away from the display and walked toward his private office, needing a moment alone before the killing started. Because even after all these years and all these battles, he had never become comfortable with what humanity was capable of when its children were threatened behind him. The display continued to track the Ghost Fleet's progress as those massive warships tore through space toward refuge. Toward whatever enemy had made the catastrophic error of thinking that a remote human colony would be an easy target, though. Distress Beacon continued its automated broadcast, still crying out into the void, still pleading for help that was already coming with fire and fury that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. Admiral Chen sat at his desk and pulled up the classified files on the Ghost Fleet's operational history. Pages and pages of battles and campaigns that were kept secret from the general public, because humanity's allies would be terrified if they knew the full extent of what these ships had done. He read through the reports one more time, reminding himself of the necessity of what was about to happen. And then he closed the files and waited for the inevitable. Somewhere out in the dark between stars, the Ghost Fleet raced toward refuge, and the galaxy was about to remember why humanity had survived. Refuge burned under alien skies that had once promised peace and prosperity to the human settlers, who had chosen this remote world as their new home. And now those same skies rained death in the form of plasma. Bombardment that turned buildings into molten slag and people into ash. Governor Alina Vasquez stood in the reinforced command bunker deep beneath the colony's administrative center, watching holographic displays that showed her people dying in real time. And she forced herself to keep watching because leaders didn't get to look away. When their decisions led to this kind of suffering, the Korvax Dominion's war machines moved through the colony streets with the methodical efficiency of a species that had conquered 17 other worlds in the past decade. And their insectoid forms seemed almost beautiful in their terrible grace as they cut down everything that moved. Alina's second in command, a former mining engineer named Ricardo, who had never expected to become a soldier, stared at the tactical display with hollow eyes that had seen too much death in the past 3 weeks. Shield Generator 7 just failed, he reported in the flat tone of someone who had moved beyond despair into a kind of numb acceptance. That leaves us with only 2 functioning generators, and they're both running at 40% capacity around them in the bunker. The remaining defenders prepared for what everyone knew would be the final assault. And these weren't professional soldiers, but miners. and farmers and teachers who had taken up weapons because the alternative was watching their families die without fighting. Back the colony had held for 3 weeks against odds that any military analyst would have called impossible. And Alina knew that their resistance had bought time for some civilians to escape into the wilderness. Though whether that would save them in the long run was questionable at best. "They're not coming," Ricardo said quietly. And Alina knew he was talking about the reinforcements she had promised, the help she had sworn would arrive if they could just hold out long enough. "No one's coming to save us," Alina didn't respond, because what could she say that wouldn't be a lie? And she had promised herself that she would never lie to her people, even when the truth was unbearable. She had sent the distress beacon on the old frequency 3 days ago, using the emergency protocol that her grandfather had made her memorize when she was just a child learning about human history and the wars that had shaped their species. Her grandfather had been a naval officer during the Succession Wars, had served on vessels whose names were still whispered across the galaxy as warnings to species that might consider humanity an easy target. And he had told her stories that gave her nightmares for years, if you were ever in trouble. He had said, with the absolute certainty of someone who had seen the Ghost Fleet in action, "Send the call on the old frequency, and they will come, no matter how far away you are, no matter what stands between you and them." But 3 days had passed, and the skies above Refuge held only enemy ships. So maybe her grandfather had been wrong, or maybe the Ghost Fleet no longer existed, or maybe humanity had simply forgotten about colonies as remote and insignificant as theirs above the planet in high orbit. Korvax's War Master Thexgal surveyed the tactical situation with satisfaction that came from a battle won through superior numbers and technology, and he felt no particular emotion about the humans dying below, because, to the Korvax, this was simply business. Refuge's location made it strategically valuable in the Ambinians' ongoing conflict with the neighboring Atrix Confederation. And the fact that humans happened to live here was irrelevant to the larger strategic picture that Thexgal's superiors had drawn. The humans had fought well for primitives. Thexgal admitted grudgingly as he reviewed casualty reports that showed his forces had taken far more losses than anticipated. But courage and determination meant nothing against the mathematical certainty of overwhelming force. "Prepare orbital bombardment," he ordered his weapons officers with the casual tone of someone ordering dinner. "The ground campaign has served its purpose in testing our new assault patterns, but the time for efficiency has arrived." The weapons officers acknowledged the command and began charging the capital ship's main plasma batteries. Weapons powerful enough to boil oceans or crack continental shelves, and in minutes they would reduce Refuge's remaining population centers to radioactive. Kratos Thexgal was composing his after-action report in his mind, already thinking about the commendations this successful campaign would earn him, when the sensor officer made a sound that the War Master had never heard before. It was a clicking, chittering noise that in Korvax's body language meant something between terror and religious awe. And Thexgal felt his leg segments lock in instinctive alarm report. He demanded, moving toward the sensor station with the rapid skittering gait of his species when agitated. The sensor officer couldn't speak and simply gestured at the display with a trembling manipulator appendage. And Thexgal looked at the readings and felt something he hadn't experienced since. He was a juvenile facing his first Predator 37. Massive spatial distortions had appeared at the edge of the system, each one representing a vessel emerging from faster-than-light travel. And the combined mass signatures made the Korvax battle group look like insects facing a tidal wave. The threat assessment system, sophisticated software that had been programmed with data on every known hostile species in the galaxy, immediately escalated its warning level to the maximum category, a designation that the Korvax roughly translated as "Begin final prayers to your ancestral hive." Thexgal had studied military history from hundreds of species, and he recognized these signatures from reports that were classified at the highest levels of Dominion intelligence. Reports that detailed what happened to species arrogant or desperate enough to provoke humanity's wrath. The Ghost Fleet had arrived, and suddenly Thexgal understood that he had made a terrible mistake down on Refuge's surface. Alina saw the change first in the faces of her people. Exhausted defenders who had been preparing to die suddenly, standing straighter and pointing at the sky with expressions she couldn't quite read. "Governor, Ricardo's voice held an emotion she hadn't heard in weeks. Something that might have been hope, or might have been fear. You need to see this. The tactical display updated, and Alina watched as new signatures appeared in orbit. Impossibly large vessels that dwarfed the Korvax warships like eagles compared to sparrows. And then the communications system crackled to life with a voice that spoke in perfect Earth-standard English. This is Admiral Marcus Chen of the Terran hegemony. "Ghost Fleet," the voice said with the kind of cold precision that made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "You are besieging a human colony." Lena's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the bunker floor as her grandfather's stories came flooding back. Tales of ships that could shatter planets and crews that had ended wars with their mere appearance. "You have 30 minutes to achieve minimum safe distance from this world," Admiral Chen continued. And Alina could hear something like controlled fury beneath the professional tone. "After that time, any vessel remaining in orbit will be treated as a valid military target." The transmission paused for just a moment before the Admiral added with finality that left no room for doubt. "This is your only warning around, Alina." The defenders stood in stunned silence as they processed what was happening, and then someone started laughing. A slightly hysterical sound that spread through the bunker like wildfire they had held. Alina realized with a clarity that cut through the fog of exhaustion and despair. They had held just long enough above them in orbit. War Master Thexkel stared at his displays and tried to calculate odds that his tactical computer told him were impossible. And he thought about his studies of human military. History and campaigns like the Scorched Stars and the Breaking of Carthan commanded 200 warships. The pride of the Korvax Dominion's military might. And surely that had to count for something against even the legendary Ghost Fleet all-vessels. He transmitted to his commanders, trying to inject confidence into his clicking voice. "Assume combat formation Alpha and prepare to demonstrate that. Superior numbers." The first human railgun round crossed the distance between the two fleets at 98% of light speed. A solid projectile accelerated to velocities that turned simple mass into a weapon of almost incomprehensible destructive power. Passed through 3 Korvax destroyers before its kinetic energy finally dissipated. And those vessels didn't explode or burn, but simply ceased to exist as coherent matter. Transformed instantly into rapidly expanding clouds of superheated plasma that had been ships and crews mere microseconds. Before, Exkel watched 372 of his warriors die in an eye blink, and understood with perfect clarity that he had led his fleet. Into a death trap revised statement, Admiral Chen's voice came again. And now the cold fury was unmistakable. "You have 15 minutes. My gunners are getting impatient." The Korvax fleet broke formation and fled. The lead vessel of the Ghost Fleet hung in space above refuge like a predator that had just cornered its prey. And the THS Absolute Zero was so massive that some of the colonists on the ground mistook it for a small moon until their sensors corrected them with readings that seemed impossibly Admiral Marcus. Chen stood on the bridge of the Absolute Zero and watched the Korvax fleet scatter in every direction like insects fleeing from light. And he felt the familiar cold satisfaction that came from reminding the galaxy why humanity had earned its reputation through blood and /et. The ship around him hummed with barely contained power. Fusion reactors generating enough energy to light up an entire solar system channeled into weapon systems that could crack planets or shatter. Fleets with equal ease tracking solutions. Locked on all fleeing vessels, his weapons, Officer reported with the calm professionalism of someone who had done this many times before, awaiting your orders. Sir Chen studied the tactical display and made the calculations that commanders had been making since humans. First picked up weapons to defend their tribes, how much force was necessary to send the right message, and how much would cross the line into unnecessary cruelty, target only the warships that are still in weapons range of refuge, he ordered. His voice carrying to every station on the bridge, "Let the others run." "We want survivors to spread the word." The Absolute Zero's main railgun batteries spoke again. Magnetic acceleration coils propelling solid projectiles to velocities that made them unstoppable. And 23 Korvax vessels that had been too slow or too stubborn to flee fast enough, simply vanished in flashes of light that briefly outshone the system's start. Chun watched the remaining Korvax ships disappear into faster-than-light travel and felt no particular emotion about the destruction he had just ordered, because this was what the Ghost Fleet existed to do: demonstrate to hostile species that attacking human colonies carried a price too terrible to contemplate all vessels. Establish orbital positions around refuge, he commanded, and across the fleet captains acknowledged and began maneuvering their massive ships into a defensive formation that would make the planet effectively impregnable. Deploy ground forces and medical teams immediately. Dropships launched from the fleet carriers like a swarm of metal insects, their atmospheric entry creating brilliant streaks across refuge's sky that the colonists below watched with expressions mixing relief and awe and lingering fear. Chun had seen that expression before on the faces of people who had been saved by the Ghost Fleet, a complicated emotion born from gratitude mixed with the unsettling realization of just how much destructive power humanity could deploy when its citizens were threatened. He materialized on refuge's surface via transport beam, the quantum disassembly and reassembly process taking only seconds, and he found himself standing in what had once been the colony's main square, but was now a landscape of rubble and burned scars around him. Ghost Fleet Marines moved with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers, establishing perimeter security and beginning search and rescue operations. And these weren't the parade ground troops that humanity deployed for show, but hardened veterans who had fought in every major conflict of the past 2 decades. Governor Alina Vasquez emerged from the command bunker supported by 2 of her people, and Chen could see the physical and emotional exhaustion written in every line of her body. The toll that 3 weeks of desperate fighting had extracted from someone who had never expected to lead a military defense. Chen saluted her with crisp precision, his dress uniform immaculate, despite commanding a battle group that had just crossed half the sector. And he felt the weight of tradition and duty that came with wearing the Ghost Fleet insignia. Governor Vasquez said formally, because even in the aftermath of battle, there were protocols to observe. Ghost Fleet responding to your distress call. I apologize for our delayed arrival. Alina stared at him for a moment, as if she couldn't quite process his words. And then she laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that held 3 weeks of terror and stress delayed. She managed to say, when she could speak again, Admiral, you crossed how many light years in less than a day? Chen's expression didn't change because she was right to question it. The Ghost Fleet had pushed their faster-than-light drives beyond normal safety parameters to get here, and several ships had suffered minor system damage from the strain. The beacon was transmitted 17 hours ago, he replied with the same flat precision. Our protocols call for response within 6 hours. We failed you, he gestured at the devastation surrounding them. At the ruins of buildings and the emergency medical stations were Ghost Fleet. Doctors were treating wounded colonists with technology that seemed almost magical compared to what the colony had possessed. This should never have happened to a human colony, Chen continued, and he meant it with every fiber of his being, because the Ghost Fleet existed specifically to prevent scenes like this. We should have been here before the first shot was fired around them. Marines continued their work with a gentleness that seemed at odds with their combat armor and weapons, lifting debris to search for survivors and distributing supplies with the same care they would show to their own families. Engineers had already begun erecting shield generators that made Refuge's original defenses look like children's toys. Massive installations that could withstand sustained orbital bombardment from an entire fleet. Lena watched the transformation of her broken colony with something like wonder in her eyes, and Chen understood what she was feeling because he had seen it before. The contrast between barely surviving and being protected by the full might of human military technology. The Korvax will return, she said quietly, and Chen heard the fear beneath her words. This was just a vanguard force according to our intelligence. Their main fleet numbers in the thousands. Chen turned to face her fully and let her see the cold certainty in his eyes, the absolute conviction that came from decades of service in humanity's most elite military formation. Governor, the Ghost Fleet wasn't created to defend human worlds. He explained with the patience of someone who had given this speech before. We have border defense forces and system patrol fleets for routine protection. He paused and looked up at the sky where more ships continued to arrive in orbit. Not just warships now, but siege platforms and carrier groups and vessels whose weapons were designed to reduce enemy civilizations to pre-industrial technology, levels we were created to ensure that species who attack human colonies understand the consequences so thoroughly that they never consider it again, Chen continued, his voice taking on an edge that made several nearby Marines glance in his direction. The absolute zero passed overhead at that moment, its massive bulk blocking out a significant portion of the sky, and colonists stopped what they were doing to stare up at the ship that had saved them. The Korvax Dominion made a mistake when they attacked refuge, Chen said softly. But there was nothing soft in his tone or his intentions. We're going to make absolutely certain it's a mistake they never forget. Alina studied his face and seemed to understand that he wasn't speaking metaphorically or making idle threats. And she thought about asking him to show mercy, but the words died in her throat because she had seen what the Korvax had done to her people. What are you going to do? She asked instead. And Chen appreciated that she was direct enough to ask the question. Even though she might not like the answer, we're going to dismantle their ability to threaten human space, he replied, with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss weather. Every military installation, every orbital platform, every warship that could potentially be used against our colonies. He looked around at the ruins of refuge, and the colonists who were emerging from hiding places to see that they had survived, and he thought about all the other human settlements scattered across the galaxy, who needed to know that they weren't forgotten. The Korvax will learn what others have learned before them. Chen said with finality that humanity protects its own, regardless of cost or distance or the strength of our enemies. A medical team rushed past carrying a wounded civilian on a stretcher, and Chen watched as Ghost Fleet doctors went to work with technology and skill that would save lives that any other species would have written off as lost. How long will you stay? Alina asked. And Chen heard the hope in her voice that maybe the Ghost Fleet would establish a permanent presence here until you're safe. He answered simply, until your defenses are strong enough to hold off anything short of a full-scale invasion, and until we've made it clear to every hostile species within 100 light-years that refuge is under our protection. He turned to leave, heading back toward the transport beam coordinates. But Alina called out to stop him, Admiral, she said, and when he looked back, she was crying openly, tears streaming down her dirt-smeared face. Thank you for not forgetting about us, Chen. Felt something crack in the professional armor he maintained, just slightly, because that was the heart of it, wasn't it? Making sure that no human colony ever felt abandoned or alone. We never forget, he said quietly. That's what the Ghost Fleet is for. The Korvax Dominion's High Council convened an emergency session within their capital hive complex on the home world of Korvax Prime, and the assembled war leaders and intelligence directors chittered among themselves with barely controlled panic that was spreading through their ranks like a disease. Reports had been arriving for 6 standard days now, each one worse than the last. And the pattern they revealed was so devastating that several council members had refused to believe the data until it had been verified by 3 independent sources. Supreme Hive Mother Kextra, eldest of the council and veteran of campaigns that had expanded the Dominion across 17 conquered systems, raised her primary manipulator. Appendages to call for silence in the traditional gesture of absolute authority summarize the situation. She commanded her intelligence chief with the clicking undertones that in Korvax communication indicated both urgency and suppressed fear. The intelligence chief, a younger male named Vixenal, who had risen quickly through the ranks by being both brilliant and brutally honest, activated the holographic display that dominated the council chamber's center. The human Ghost Fleet entered our space 6 days ago, he began, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone reporting facts too terrible for emotional processing. They have since conducted systematic military operations across 14 of our occupied systems. The display showed system after system lighting up in red. And Kextra felt her leg segments tremble as she recognized strategic Installations that had taken decades to establish being marked as destroyed or captured, they haven't attacked civilian populations. Vixenal continued, and there was something like horrified respect in his tone. No orbital bombardments of cities, no mass killings. Nothing that would constitute what the galactic community defines as war crimes. Another council member, a war leader named Throxon, who had commanded the initial assault on Refuge, made the chittering sound that indicated confusion mixed with suspicion. Then what exactly are they doing? He demanded, because in his experience, warfare was about breaking an enemy's will through overwhelming destruction. If they're not targeting our population centers, they're dismantling our military capability with surgical precision, Vixenal interrupted. And his tone made it clear this was somehow worse than simple destruction. Every orbital defense platform, every shipyard, every military base has been identified and eliminated. The holographic display zoomed in to show tactical recordings from the various engagements. And Kextra watched with growing horror as human warships moved through. Korvac's defensive positions like knives through soft tissue in one recording. A single human dreadnought faced off against an entire Korvac's battle group of 47 vessels. And the engagement lasted less than 3 minutes before every Korvac ship was either destroyed or crippled beyond repair. While the human vessels sustained minimal damage, our fleets are being obliterated, another council member said with the tone of someone still struggling to accept reality. The 5th Armada, the 7th Fleet. Both Gonvixenal nodded grimly and brought up casualty figures that made even. Kextra's compound eyes widen in shock. Total military losses stand at 372 capital ships, over 2,000 support vessels, and approximately 40,000 trained warriors, he reported with clinical detachment. The humans have lost exactly 0 vessels and sustained damage to only 3 ships, all of which have already been repaired. The council chamber fell silent, except for the unconscious clicking sounds that Korvacs made when processing information that contradicted their understanding. Avrilida Kextra had studied military history from 100 different species, and she knew that casualty ratios like this didn't happen between roughly equivalent technological civilizations. They happened when advanced species crushed primitives, or when one side had such overwhelming advantages that the conflict couldn't properly be called a war. How is this possible? She asked, directing the question at her intelligence chief, but really asking the universe itself. We are the Korvax Dominion. We have conquered 17 species. Our military technology is among the most advanced in this sector. Vixenal hesitated before answering, and Kextra recognized the body language of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. We made several critical errors in our threat assessment of humanity. He began carefully. First, we assumed that because humans are relatively new to the galactic community and maintain a small number of colonies, they must be weak. He pulled up comparative data showing human territorial holdings versus other major powers. And Kextra saw that humanity indeed controlled far less space than the Dominion. Second, we failed to adequately research human military history, Vixenal continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a confession. The ghost fleet that is currently destroying our forces has existed for over 200 human years. The display changed to show archival footage from various conflicts, and Kextra watched battles that had taken place long before the Korvacs had even achieved spaceflight. In one engagement dated nearly a century ago, a much smaller ghost fleet had faced a coalition of 6 different species, who had united specifically to destroy humanity's expanding presence. And the human forces had systematically crushed an enemy that outnumbered them 20-1. They call it the Scorched Stars campaign. Vixenal explained as the footage showed human warships reducing enemy installations to slag. It ended with 3 of those 6 species suing for peace and accepting permanent restrictions on their military capabilities. Another council member made the sound of dawning comprehension and horror. And the other 3? She asked. Extinct. Vixenal replied simply, not through genocide or planetary bombardment, but through complete military defeat followed by economic collapse when they could no longer maintain their empires through force. Kextra absorbed this information and understood with terrible clarity that the Korvax Dominion had stumbled into a conflict with a species that had perfected warfare on a level far beyond what their small territorial holdings suggested. The humans maintain this ghost fleet despite being at peace, she said slowly, working through the implications. Which means they anticipate exactly this kind of scenario, worse than that. Vixenal corrected her, pulling up more historical data. They maintain the ghost fleet specifically to ensure this kind of scenario results in overwhelming retaliation. The entire purpose of these vessels is to make attacking human colonies so costly that no rational species would consider it throxin. The war leader who had ordered the initial assault on Refuge made a sound of protest, but Refuge was a minor colony, he argued. Barely 3,000 inhabitants, no strategic value beyond its location. Surely a proportional response would have been. There is no such thing as a proportional response when it comes to human colonies. Vixenal interrupted sharply. Our intelligence files, which I now realize we should have consulted before attacking Refuge, contain reports from 14 different species about human retaliation protocols. He pulled up document after document. Reports filed by various civilizations over the past 2 centuries. And they all said essentially the same thing, attacking even the smallest human. Settlement triggers a response from the Ghost Fleet, and the Ghost Fleet does not negotiate or show mercy until they have extracted a price that ensures the attacking species never forgets the lesson. We need to sue for peace. Immediately, one council member said with the clicking urgency that indicated near panic, before they destroy our entire military capability. Kextra considered this and realized that the situation was actually worse than simple military defeat. The humans weren't trying to conquer Korvax's territory or subjugate their species. They were methodically removing the Dominion's ability to threaten anyone, which meant that even after peace was achieved, the Korvax would be left vulnerable to all their other enemies. What are the human terms? She asked Vixenal. Surely they must have transmitted demands or conditions. The intelligence chief made a gesture that indicated frustration and something like grudging admiration. They haven't transmitted any demands. He replied, they simply continue their operations, destroying our military assets and ignoring all our attempts at communication. Another council member voiced the question they were all thinking, what do they want? Vixenal pulled up the most recent tactical assessment and highlighted something that several analysts had noted based on their targeting patterns and operational tempo. Our best estimate is that they intend to reduce our military capabilities to approximately 20% of current levels, he said with the precision of someone who had run the calculations multiple times. Enough to maintain internal security and defend against pirates, but not enough to threaten neighboring species or project power beyond our core systems. The implications of this crashed over the council like a wave. And Kextra understood with perfect clarity what the humans were doing. They were surgically removing the Dominion's fangs and claws, ensuring that the Korvax would spend the next generation rebuilding their forces while every species in the sector learned exactly what happened to those who attacked human colonies. How long? She asked quietly. The Korvax surrender transmission reached the THS Absolute Zero while Admiral Marcus Chen was reviewing tactical reports from the latest engagement, and he read through the terms being offered with the detached professionalism of someone who had accepted multiple enemy surrenders during his long career there. Korvax were offering complete capitulation with no conditions, full reparations for damage to Refuge, permanent restrictions on military deployments near human space, and a formal recognition of all human colonies as sovereign Terran hegemony territory regardless of their location. Forwarded the transmission to Terran Command for final approval, but he already knew what their response would be, because the Ghost Fleet's mission had never been about conquest or revenge, but about sending a message so clear that it would echo across the galaxy for generations. 3 weeks, he thought as he looked at the campaign timeline displayed on his office wall. Exactly the same amount of time that Refuge had held out against impossible odds before the Ghost Fleet arrived. There was a certain poetic symmetry to that, and Chen appreciated the way it would read in. Future history texts and military academies where officers studied the campaigns that defined humanity's relationship with hostile species. Sir, his communications officer called from the bridge. Terran Command has approved the Korvax surrender terms and authorized you to negotiate final conditions. Chen stood and straightened his uniform, then made his way to the bridge where his senior staff had assembled to witness the conclusion of yet another campaign that would be added to the Ghost Fleet's classified operational history. "Open a direct channel to the Korvax High Council," he ordered. And within seconds, the holographic display showed the insectoid forms of the Dominion's leadership arranged in what he recognized as their posture of submissions. Preem Hive Mother Kextra spoke first, her translated words carrying undertones of defeat and hard-won wisdom. "Admiral Chen, the Korvax Dominion formally surrenders and accepts full responsibility for our unprovoked assault on the human colony of refuge. We await your terms." Chen studied the alien leader for a moment and saw in her body language something he had seen before in defeated enemies, not just fear of further military action, but a genuine understanding of the mistake they had made. "The Terran hegemony accepts your surrender," he replied with formal precision. "Our terms are as follows." He pulled up the document that Terran Command had transmitted. Terms that had been refined over centuries of dealing with species that learned to laid about humanity's protective nature toward its colonies first. The Korvax Dominion will formally recognize all human colonies, regardless of their size or location, as territories under full Terran hegemony protection and sovereignty. Chen read, "Any future aggression against these territories will be treated as an act of war against humanity itself." Kextra made the Korvax gesture of acknowledgement, and Chen continued, "Second, the Dominion will pay reparations to Refuge Colony in the amount of 50 billion galactic credits, to be used for rebuilding infrastructure and compensating families of the deceased." This was a staggering sum, enough to transform Refuge from a struggling frontier settlement into a prosperous world. And Chen saw several Korvax Council members flinch at the figure. "Third, the Dominion will accept permanent monitoring stations in your border systems adjacent to human space, staffed by Terran forces and equipped to provide early warning of any military buildup that might threaten our colonies." Yes, this was the key provision, the one that ensured the Korvax would never again be able to launch a surprise attack on human settlements. And Kextra hesitated before responding. "The monitoring stations are acceptable," she said carefully, "but we request that they be limited to passive observation and not equipped with offensive capabilities that could threaten our own security." Chen had expected this and had already received authorization to make this concession. "Agreed," he replied. "The stations will be purely defensive and will share their sensor data with your own military to provide mutual security against external threats." It's actually benefited both species. And Chen saw Kextra relax slightly as she realized the humans weren't trying to cripple the Dominion's ability to defend itself against legitimate threats. "Finally," Chen concluded, "the Dominion will participate in a joint committee with Terran representatives to establish protocols for conflict resolution and communication, ensuring that future disputes can be addressed through diplomatic channels rather than military action." Kextra made the full-body gesture that indicated complete acceptance and relief. "The Korvax Dominion accepts all terms without reservation," she stated formally. "We also wish to extend our deepest apologies to the people of Refuge and to humanity as a whole for our actions." Chen nodded acknowledgement, but his expression remained neutral, because accepting apologies too graciously might be interpreted as weakness. "The formal treaty documents will be transmitted within the hour," he said. "Ghost Fleet forces will begin withdrawal from Korvax space once the monitoring stations are established and the first reparation payment has been verified." The transmission ended, and Chen stood alone on the bridge for a moment, looking out at the stars beyond the viewport and thinking about the cycles of violence and deterrence that shaped galactic politics. His executive officer, Commander Sarah Park, approached and stood beside him in companionable silence before speaking. 3 weeks, she said quietly, echoing his earlier thoughts. "We held them to account for exactly as long as Refuge held out. It seemed appropriate," Chen replied. The people of Refuge needed to see that their sacrifice and courage weren't forgotten or dismissed as acceptable losses. Park looked at the tactical displays showing Ghost Fleet vessels beginning to form up for the journey back to their deployment stations scattered across human space. "Do you think the message was received?" she asked. "Will other species learn from the Korvax example?" Chen considered this question, one that every Ghost Fleet commander had wrestled with since the formation was first established over 2 centuries ago. Some will learn, he said finally. They'll add humanity to the list of species not to provoke, and they'll leave our colonies alone. But there will always be others who think they're different, stronger, smarter than those who came before. He turned away from the viewport and headed toward his office, already thinking about the after-action reports he would need to file and the families of refugees dead who deserved to know their loved ones hadn't died for nothing. That's why the Ghost Fleet exists, he concluded. Not to prevent every attack, but to ensure that each one costs the aggressor so dearly that the lesson spreads through simple self-preservation back on refuge. Governor Elena Vasquez stood in the rebuilt main square and watched as the last Ghost Fleet Marines prepared to depart. Their mission complete, now that the colony's new defenses were fully operational, the transformation of refuge over the past 3 weeks had been almost miraculous, with human engineering teams working around the clock to not just repair the damage, but upgrade every system too. Military-grade specifications, the shield generators that now protected the colony could withstand orbital bombardment from an entire fleet. The sensor arrays could detect incoming threats from multiple light-years away, and the automated defense platforms could engage hostile vessels before they even entered the system. But more than the physical improvements, Alina saw a change in her people. Survivors who had discovered reservoirs of strength they hadn't known they possessed, and who now carried themselves with the quiet confidence of those who had been tested and not found. "Wanting Governor Vasquez?" a young Marine said, approaching with the formal bearing of someone delivering an official message. "Admiral Chen wanted me to give you this before we depart." Alina accepted the data chip and plugged it into her personal display, and Admiral Chen's face appeared in holographic form. "Governor," his recorded message began. "By the time you see this, the Ghost Fleet will be preparing to leave refuge. Our mission here is complete." Alina felt an unexpected surge of emotion as she realized that after 3 weeks of having humanity's most powerful military force protecting her world, they were returning to whatever distant stations they called home. "I want you and your people to understand something," Chen continued, his expression serious but not unkind. "What happened here should never have occurred. A human colony should never have to stand alone against overwhelming force for 3 weeks while waiting for help to arrive." He paused and seemed to look directly at her. "Despite this being a recording, but you did stand. And that matters more than you might realize," he said with quiet intensity. "You proved that humanity's strength doesn't come just from our warships or our technology, but from the courage and determination of ordinary people who refuse to surrender, even when surrender seems rational." Alina found herself blinking back tears as she listened to reparations from the Korvax will ensure refuge prospers, Chen concluded. "But more importantly, word of your resistance has already spread across human space and beyond. Other colonies now know that if they can hold on, if they can resist just a little longer, the Ghost Fleet will come." The recording paused for a moment before Chen added,